You're lying in bed at 2 a.m., phone glowing against your face, thumb scrolling past a photo you shouldn't have opened. Your chest feels tight in a way that has nothing to do with your lungs. Tomorrow you'll text a friend, maybe cry in a parked car, maybe order comfort food and watch something numbing until you fall asleep. You have 100 tools for this pain: therapists, playlists, self-help books, a whole culture built to catch you when love falls apart. Now imagine none of that exists. No phone, no friend 3 time zones away who will pick up at 2 a.m. No therapist, no bottle of wine, no album written specifically to make heartbreak feel understood. Just you, a fire, 20 other people who all know exactly whose bed you're not sleeping in tonight, and about 100,000 years to figure out how to survive this feeling without losing your mind. So here's the question, and it's a simple one. For nearly the entire span of human existence, with no privacy, no distraction, and no modern concept of healing, how did our ancestors survive the very same heartbreak you're feeling right now? Let's start with the part nobody thinks about first. They couldn't hide. In a hunter-gatherer band of 20 to 50 people, the standard-size anthropologists like Kim Hill and Robert Kelly have documented across dozens of surviving forager societies, there was no version of heartbreak that happened in private. If your partner left you for someone else in the group, that someone else was probably 15 feet away, skinning a hair in plain view every single day. There was no moving to a new city. There was no blocking their number. You woke up next to the wreckage of your relationship every morning because the wreckage was also your only source of food, protection, and survival. Think about that for a second. Modern heartbreak lets you disappear. Ancient heartbreak forced you to keep showing up. And here's what nobody tells you. That constant exposure wasn't only torture, it was also, strangely, a kind of forced therapy. Psychologist and anthropologist Helen Fisher, who has spent decades studying the neuroscience of romantic rejection, found that heartbreak activates the same brain regions as physical pain and even addiction withdrawal. The insula, the anterior cingulate cortex, areas tied to craving and loss. Your ancestors' brains were doing the exact same thing yours does right now. But because they couldn't isolate, couldn't binge watch their way into numbness, they were forced into something modern psychology now considers essential to healing: repeated low-stakes exposure to the loss inside a community that witnessed it happening. They didn't get to avoid the pain. They got dragged through it daily in front of people who understood exactly what they were looking at. That's the first thing ancient humans had that you don't. Not comfort, company that couldn't leave. Now here's the second problem, and it's uglier than the first. Heartbreak back then wasn't just emotional, it was often a direct threat to your survival. In small foraging bands, a mate wasn't simply a romantic partner, they were a co-provider, a second set of hands for carrying children, gathering tubers, defending against predators, splitting the impossible workload of staying alive in the wild. When anthropologist Kristen Hawkes studied the Hadza of Tanzania, one of the last hunter-gatherer societies on Earth, she documented just how interdependent partnerships were for daily caloric survival. Losing a partner didn't just break your heart, it could break your food supply. Here's what doesn't make sense until you sit with it. Your ancestors sometimes had to grieve and renegotiate survival logistics in the same week. There was no space to just feel your feelings for 6 months. The band still needed meat, the children still needed watching. Grief had a deadline whether the heart was ready or not, but this brutal urgency created something unexpected: speed. Anthropological studies of modern-day foragers, including work by Marjorie Shostak among the hoansi of the Kalahari, describe remarriage or repartnering happening astonishingly fast after a breakup or death, sometimes within weeks. Not because ancient people loved less deeply than we do, because the structure of their lives didn't allow prolonged isolation, and the community actively pushed grieving individuals back into connection, sometimes within days. It sounds cold. It might actually have been kind. A single mother in the Kalahari couldn't afford to sit alone with her sadness for a year, and the group knew it, so they didn't let her. There's a strange mercy hiding inside that harshness. Nobody was allowed to disappear into their pain for long, which brings us to the third piece of the puzzle, and this is where it gets almost unbearably human. They buried their grief, literally. At Sunghir, a 34,000-year-old burial site in what is now Russia, archaeologists uncovered the remains of 2 children and an adult male, covered in thousands of painstakingly carved ivory beads, adorned with fox teeth, ochre, and ornaments that would have taken months of communal labor to produce. This wasn't casual. This was a society redirecting enormous energy in the middle of an ice age into honoring loss. And at Shanidar Cave in Iraq, Neanderthal remains dating back roughly 50,000 to 60,000 years were found alongside pollen clusters, leading early researchers to propose the individual had been buried with flowers, a theory still debated, but the burial itself, deliberate and careful, is not. Here's what nobody tells you about grief rituals like these. They weren't really for the dead, they were technology for the living. A ritual gives pain a container. It tells the grieving person without needing words that their loss matters enough to interrupt the entire group's routine. Modern heartbreak often happens in silence. You suffer, you function. Nobody around you changes their schedule because your world ended. Ancient heartbreak, especially around death, forced the whole band to stop and acknowledge it. There's a kind of relief in that, isn't there? Being seen without having to ask. Now let's talk about the piece almost nobody expects: sound, specifically singing. At Hohlefels in Germany, archaeologists uncovered a flute carved from a vulture's wing bone, dated to roughly 40,000 years ago, one of the oldest known musical instruments on Earth. Music, ethnomusicologists argue, likely predates even language in its emotional function. Long before your ancestors had therapy speak, before processing was a word anyone used, they had rhythm, chant, and collective singing around a fire. Anthropologist Helen Dissanayake has argued that shared rhythmic activity, singing, dancing, drumming together, triggers oxytocin release and synchronizes emotional states across a group, essentially forcing isolated pain into a shared experience. Here's the part that should stop you for a second. Heartbroken and grieving people, instead of being left alone with their thoughts, were pulled into a fire circle and made to move and sing alongside everyone else. Their pain didn't get to stay private. It got folded into rhythm, passed hand to hand, until it belonged to the group as much as to the person feeling it. You cope with heartbreak through a playlist you listen to alone, headphones in, world shut out. They coped with it through a song that everyone sang at once, together, out loud. One of those is isolating. The other is almost impossible to feel alone inside. There's one more layer to this, and it might be the most important: the sheer size of their support system. Anthropologist Robin Dunbar's research on human social bonding suggests our brains are wired to maintain meaningful relationships with roughly 150 people, a figure now famously known as Dunbar's number. In a forager band, even a smaller circle of 20 to 50 people meant near constant in-person contact with individuals who had known you your entire life, not acquaintances, not people you'd met twice at a party, but people who had watched you grow up, who understood your patterns, who could read your face across a fire and know something was wrong before you said a word. Here's what doesn't make sense until you compare it to now. Modern life has more connections than any human generation in history, and somehow more loneliness than almost any generation in history. Your ancestors had the opposite problem. Fewer options, but nobody was ever truly alone with their pain because there was nowhere private enough to be alone in the first place. Isolation, for most of human history, wasn't a coping mechanism. It was almost a physical impossibility. So let's zoom out, because all of this, the exposure, the urgency, the rituals, the songs, the crowded intimacy of small band life, adds up to something bigger than a survival strategy. It's a mirror for what heartbreak actually is. Heartbreak isn't a malfunction. It's the emotional fingerprint of a system that worked. If your ancestors hadn't bonded so intensely with mates, family, and community, they wouldn't have survived long enough to become your ancestors at all. Pair bonding, aided by neurochemicals like oxytocin and vasopressin, kept two adults cooperating long enough to raise children who could barely walk, let alone hunt, for years at a time. The pain you feel when a relationship ends is the exact same wiring that made human cooperation, family, and civilization possible in the first place. You don't get one without the other. Here's the part that reframes everything. Your broken heart isn't proof that something is wrong with you. It's proof that the ancient machinery for love, the same machinery that let a species of hairless, weak, slow-running primates conquer every continent on Earth, is still running exactly as designed, tens of thousands of years later, inside your chest, at 2 a.m., over someone who probably doesn't even know you're awake. Winter came at your ancestors with 4 weapons, and heartbreak came at them the same way, with isolation, with survival pressure, with unspoken grief, with silence, and they answered every single one, not with willpower alone, but with each other. They answered isolation with a camp too small to disappear in. They answered survival pressure with speed, pushing each other back toward connection before despair could take root. They answered unspoken grief with beads, ochre, and burial sites that took months to build, because pain deserved a monument, and they answered silence with flutes carved from bone and songs sung by firelight. Zoom out far enough and heartbreak stops looking like a personal failure and starts looking like a fossil, an emotional artifact passed down from every human who ever loved someone enough to be devastated when they were gone. You didn't invent this feeling. You inherited it, fully formed, from a woman at Sunghir who buried a child in beads, from a Neanderthal at Shanidar surrounded by flowers no one asked her to bring, from every grieving hunter who kept walking beside the person who broke her heart because the whole camp needed the meat she carried. The ache in your chest tonight is thousands of centuries old, and it has never once meant you're broken. It has always meant you're capable of the one thing that built everything humans have ever accomplished together, attachment strong enough to hurt when it's gone. So the next time you're lying in bed at 2 a.m., phone glowing against your face, chest tight over someone who isn't there anymore, know this. You are not failing to cope the way people used to. If anything, you're coping with less. No fire circle. No 20 faces who've known you your whole life, watching, ready to pull you back into rhythm before the silence gets too loud. Just you, a screen, and a feeling that has outlived every civilization that ever tried to explain it. Your ancestors never cured heartbreak. They just made sure no one ever had to survive it alone.